You weren't in denial. You had reasons. Good ones. Thoughtful ones. The kind of reasons that made sense when you said them out loud, to yourself, to the people who asked, to the part of you that kept raising its hand, trying to be heard. You weren't ignoring what you felt. You were explaining it. And that is a very different problem. Because denial is easy to catch, but a beautiful explanation is almost impossible to argue with. There is a particular kind of person who never ignores their feelings. They process them. They examine them. They turn them over carefully, looking for the most reasonable interpretation. And then, having found a reasonable interpretation, they set the feeling aside. Not because they dismissed it, but because they explained it. This is one of the most sophisticated ways a person can abandon themselves, and one of the hardest to recognize because it looks exactly like thoughtfulness, like emotional maturity, like being the kind of person who doesn't overreact. This is about what it costs when your explanations are better than your instincts. It usually starts with something that doesn't sit right. A feeling, a hesitation, a moment of unease that arrives before you have the words to describe it. And then, almost immediately, the explanation arrives. They're just stressed. This isn't a pattern, it's a bad week. I'm being too sensitive. I've been tired lately. That's why this feels bigger than it is. Everyone has things they're working through. And the explanation is not wrong. That is the important thing to understand. The explanation is often accurate. People do get stressed. You can be sensitive sometimes. Everyone does have things they're working through. The explanation contains truth, but it uses that truth to arrive at a conclusion that protects you from having to act on what you felt. And that is where the cost begins. Not in the lying, in the truth that was used to avoid a harder truth. This pattern tends to appear most in people who think carefully, people who are fair, who genuinely try to see multiple sides, who have been told, or have told themselves, that feelings are not always reliable, that first reactions can be wrong, that the generous interpretation is usually the right one. And all of that is true. Feelings are not always reliable. First reactions can be wrong. Generosity in interpretation is often a virtue, but those truths can be weaponized, not by someone else, by yourself. When you are very good at finding the fair interpretation, you can use that skill to talk yourself out of things that were actually trying to protect you. You can explain away a pattern by focusing on individual exceptions. You can explain away a feeling by finding a technically accurate reason. It might be wrong. And you can do this so elegantly, so convincingly, so thoroughly, that you never have to confront the possibility that the feeling was right all along. In relationships, this pattern becomes particularly costly because relationships give you so much material to work with. There is always context. There is always history. There is always something that happened to them, something they're dealing with, something that explains why this particular moment doesn't mean what it feels like it means. So you explained the way they spoke to you, explained by their stress, the way warmth arrived inconsistently, explained by their past, the way your needs were met only partially, only sometimes, explained by their limitations. And because each explanation was individually reasonable, you never had to see what the explanations, taken together, were pointing to. That this was a pattern, that the pattern had a cost, that the cost was being paid entirely by you. The deepest cost of explaining everything away is not the situations you stayed in too long. It is what the habit did to your relationship with yourself. Because every time you explained away what you felt, you sent a message to the part of you that was paying attention. The message was, your observations are subject to review. Your feelings need to pass a test before they can be trusted. Your first sense of something is not reliable enough to act on. And after hearing that message enough times, that part of you started to go quiet. Not because it stopped noticing, but because it had learned that noticing would only lead to another explanation that made it wrong. And that is the real cost. Not just the decisions you explained yourself into, but the internal voice that learned to stop offering its observations because you had become so skilled at talking it out of them. I want to be clear about something. This is not an argument against thinking carefully, against being fair, against looking for context before drawing conclusions. Those things matter. The world needs people who are thoughtful before they react. But there is a difference between thinking carefully and using careful thinking as a reason to never trust yourself. Between being fair to others and being so fair to others that you are consistently unfair to yourself. Between looking for context and using context as a way of explaining away every signal that something isn't right. The skill is not the problem. The problem is when the skill is only ever used in one direction, when it explains away your discomfort but never theirs, when it finds reasons your feelings are wrong, but never reasons they might be right. If you have spent years explaining away what you felt, I want you to hear this. The feelings you explained did not disappear because you found a reason for them. They went somewhere quieter. They became the unease you couldn't quite locate, the exhaustion that didn't make sense given how much you slept, the sadness that arrived without a clear cause, the sense of distance from your own life that you kept explaining as something else. Your feelings were not wrong. They were waiting beneath the explanations, beneath the reasons, beneath every story that made the feeling easier to set aside. They are still there,